I spent a little time in the courts of this country, and I'm going to tell you, I'm going to start off this conversation by saying that I'm not a bankruptcy judge nor a bankruptcy litigant, and in fact, do not claim any expertise whatsoever in the area of bankruptcy. But I have some serious concerns that really bother me about some things that are going on. And I would hope at least that the American people have these same concerns, because I really believe that the third branch of government, the judiciary, is for recourse for all citizens, big and small. I think that the fallback position where politics should not interfere, but due process should prevail. And I believe that the protection of the minority interest of whatever we may be doing is best protected in the courts of our country. And I look at what's going on tonight, and I've been trying to figure out, and I'm going to tell you, you're going to hear me ask a lot of questions tonight that I would like someone to give answers to, because I don't understand where things are going. But I'm looking at what's going on with the automobile industry in this country. You know, the big three automakers in this country have been symbols of corporate greatness for my entire lifetime. We all have a debate about who made the best car, what's the best car ever made, but you know, most Americans would argue for some form of a GM car, a Ford, or a Chrysler as the best car they ever drove. Our grandfathers and our fathers have owned these vehicles and have worked with these companies, and they have been respected and honored across this nation. Now these companies are in trouble. At least two of them seem to be in a lot of trouble: Chrysler and General Motors. And at least it has been indicated through the media that Chrysler is going to be seeking recourse in the bankruptcy courts. Now, what's interesting, the reason I say it's been indicated, because in the normal course of things, what you normally see is that the board of directors, through its chief executive officer, will have a vote, or will discuss the economic situation of the company, and will come up with the fact that it's just not viable, that they're going to need at least a reorganization and the cancellation of some of their debts to be able to maintain order within the company and be able to be a viable company. But in the case of Chrysler, the announcement was made by President Barack Obama to the media in a speech that he made, announcing Chrysler would go into bankruptcy. At least it's my personal opinion that I don't believe at that time Mr. Obama held any position in the corporate structure of Chrysler to speak on their behalf, other than he is the President of the United States, and he may have more knowledge than some of the rest of us. But it would be normal for Chrysler to make that announcement. But then it would be normal for the board of directors of Chrysler to fire the executives of their company if they're not doing a good job, and it would be normal for the board of directors of General Motors to do the hiring and firing of executives that they've hired to manage their company. But in March 29th of this year, President Obama forced the CEO, Rick Wagner, of General Motors to resign from his post. As far as anyone can tell, this marks the first time in American history that a United States president has directly intervened in the daily running of an American business. So we start with that announcement. The CEO, Mr. Wagner, is fired by the president, and then the president announces, not the CEO of Chrysler, but the president announces the bankruptcy of Chrysler. Now, this bankruptcy, under normal circumstances, would go before a bankruptcy judge, and we have a set of laws that are established in this country. They're called creditors' rights, and we have creditors that stand in different positions when it comes to being repaid on debts. depending on whether they're secured or unsecured creditors. And we have a battery of laws that makes that determination, and the bankruptcy court, doing way more complicated analysis than I just did, comes up with who gets paid what and when and where and how and what happens. What assets get sold, what liabilities get paid either all or part. And these are laws that are on the books that pretty well anybody can go see, and they're from time to time changed by the legislative body. But we understand now that from what the newspapers tell us, that the Obama administration, through President Obama, have announced the deal that's going to be, they expect to be rubber stamped by the bankruptcy court. That deal is, according to the papers, a 55% ownership of Chrysler will be owned by the UAW, United Auto Workers. So the laborers of that company will be owning 55% of Chrysler. Then 35% of Chrysler will be owned by Fiat, a foreign company out of Italy and other places, I'm sure. 8% of Chrysler will be owned by the United States government, and 2% of Chrysler will be owned by the Canadian government. And I suppose if we look at who's normally involved in corporate structure, you would have stockholders and preferred stockholders that are probably in there someplace. And it looks like to me that they're divested of any interest in this trade. Now let me say that when I say this should be something that the court makes a decision on based upon creditors' law. But it seems to be this is being shoved into the hands of the court with an announcement by the White House saying, this is a settlement these people have agreed to, and you will do it this way. I wonder who's looking out for the stockholder. I don't own any Chrysler stock, but if I owned a share of Chrysler stock, I would think at one point in time I thought I owned a portion of the Chrysler Corporation, that I was one of the owners of the business. Because we can cut through all the mystique of a corporate structure, the mystique that many call the bad guys, the big corporations. But big corporations are nothing more than a gathering of people who are called shareholders, who invest their hard-earned money into a company, expecting that company to make profits, and in turn return that value to them by an increase in stock price and possibly a dividend. It is Americans and others investing in America. That's what a corporation is all about. And whether it's a small corporation that's in Round Rock, Texas, where I come from, that maybe has 20 shareholders, or whether it's a gigantic corporation like the Chrysler Corporation that probably has, who knows, 1 million shareholders, those people have invested their money and they have some interest in that business, and through their representatives that they put on the board and elect to the board, they have supposedly have a voice in what's going on. And yet, if this deal is the deal we're talking about, I don't see where these shareholders, whether they be preferred or whether they be ordinary stock shareholders, I don't see where they're accommodated at all. You could hear some criticize and say that the federal government is taking over the automobile industry. And of course, I'm sure that they would argue, well, certainly not in the case of Chrysler, because we're not going to own but 8% of Chrysler. Yeah, but their agent, the group that donates 99% by the last report of their political donations to the Democratic Party, the UAW, owns controlling interest 55%. And that is assuming, there seems to be an assumption that when this when this is announced by the White House that this is the deal, even though it seems that some of these preferred creditors have actually stood up a little bit and said, well, wait a minute, we didn't make this deal. But this seems to be that these people are then by the White House called not cooperative or other things. In fact, it is reported in the newspapers that they twisted the arms of these preferred creditors to a point where they felt like that they were being threatened and not being able to look out for the interests of their people. And, of course, the finger was pointed to them as the big, rich preferred creditors, the big, rich bondholders. But in reality, these companies that were stepping up and saying, we're not going to be threatened by the administration. We're going to stand firm because it's not just a couple of great big rich folks. They've got lots of people, including other people's pension funds, that are invested in their hedge funds and their groups that own this interest. According to Thomas Laurel, global practice head of the Financial Restructuring and Insolvency Group at White & Case, they said that Perella Weinberg Partners was directly threatened by the White House and in essence compelled to withdraw its opposition to the Obama-Chrysler restructuring deal under the threat that the full force of the White House press corps would destroy its reputation if it continued to fight. That statement should concern us all. The White House press corps is supposed to be a press corps that is gathering news and making inquiries, not becoming an arm of the White House or the White House's restructuring force that they're putting together to restructure this deal for Chrysler. It should concern every American that the White House is threatening the use of those people who sit in those press conferences supposedly asking the tough questions of the president. They're threatening that they can use them to harm these individual bondholders, these bondholder companies. I think there's something tragically wrong with that. And one of the questions I ask is, where are our courts in this situation? I mean, the stockholders are being left with their interest basically dissolved in the Chrysler Corporation. The bondholders are being threatened by the press corps of the White House to their detriment, to vote to the detriment of their shareholders, to take possibly 25 cents or less on the dollar as part of the deal. When there are creditors' rights laws that should be looked to by the bankruptcy court. And if you're not getting good recourse from the bankruptcy courts, there's other courts you can go to. I'm very disappointed that there seems to be some weakness, that the courts are not standing up for what could be, and in my estimation would be, a large body of people whose defined rights are being forced away from them by the heavy hand of the White House. And, the White House heavy hand is a dangerous place to be. I'll remind you that President Harry Truman seized the nation's steel mills during the Korean War in order to avoid a shutdown during a strike. He could have sought an injunction barring the strike under the Taft-Hartley law, but instead he chose to seize based on his powers as commander-in-chief. He specifically notified Congress of the right to reverse or endorse his action, but Congress chose not to act. The Supreme Court overturned Truman's executive order. The legal questions were, has the Congress granted the president the power to take possession of the property? The answer was no. Does the Constitution grant the President the power to take possession of the property? And the answer was no. Is Truman's executive order in compliance with the Constitution? And the answer was no. And the opinion written by Justice Black said all powers of the presidency are contained in the Constitution or in subsequent acts of Congress granting specific powers to the executive. The contention that the aggregate power of the Constitution and acts of Congress create new, more far-reaching powers was rejected by the court. Under Taft-Hartley Act of 1947, Congress has addressed the precise issue of labor strikes and national security and has chosen not to grant the President the right to break a strike. Likewise, nowhere in the Constitution is the executive granted the right to seize power. An evaluation says Youngstown was instrumental in reaffirming that the President cannot legislate, only execute legislation passed by Congress. Black wrote the Constitution limits his function in the lawmaking process to recommending of laws he thinks wise and the vetoing of laws he thinks bad. The ruling limits the nature of the executive order to carrying out the implementation of laws already established by Congress. Now, I guess a question that we would have in what's going on in the Chrysler case and to some extent the General Motors case, which we'll get to in a little while, has Congress granted the President the power to take control of the negotiations of a private corporation in an attempt to make a settlement to go before the bankruptcy court? And I would certainly argue that the Congress has not given the President that power. Nor do I think that the Constitution grants President Obama the power to take control of the negotiations to be submitted to a bankruptcy court and to threaten those who choose not to enter into these negotiations with abuse by the press corps, the White House press corps, that would harm their business. I don't think the Constitution in any way, form, or fashion grants that power to the President of the United States. And I think what's going on with the White House and its heavy-handed manipulation of the duties and responsibility of the bankruptcy court is nowhere granted by Congress or by the Constitution of the United States. And I think Americans ought to be looking at this. And Americans ought to be concerned about this. These are private businesses owned by private people who borrowed money from other groups of people who either are shareholders or lenders in some form or fashion, whose rights are defined by law. And for the President of the United States and the White House to intervene to force a settlement to be submitted to the court and then ask the court to basically rubber stamp that settlement without looking to the protection of these other rights of the other individuals that are involved. To me, these raise questions that we need to be asking. Because if the government can do this to the Chrysler Corporation and the millions of stockholders that own Chrysler Corporation, who else could they do it to that stood in the way of their negotiations? And who authorized? Where does the Constitution or the Congress authorize the President of the United States to heavy-handedly negotiate in this private situation? And where does it authorize the turning over of almost 50% of the, well, it is more than 50%, 55% of the business to the laborers who work there in the form of the ownership by their union? And why isn't it quid pro quo when you look at what that union has done in 2008? That union, according to reporting that has been done And under the Open Secrets, according to Open Secrets, the UAW gave 99% of its political contributions to the Democrats in the '08 cycle. Why? You give 99% and you own 55% of the company. Is that the way it's supposed to work? Shouldn't some court somewhere ask that question? Shouldn't some courageous litigant somewhere stand up for the rights of the stockholder? Stand up for the rights of the bondholders? Speak out for those preferred creditors? Shouldn't someone be going to court and speaking out on these people's behalf? I have real concerns because I start from the premise that I believe that that third branch of government that I served in for 20 years is there for the protection of all Americans. That's what our court system is about. And if we are going to politicize, and as we look now to a appointment of a new Supreme Court justice, if we're going to so politicize our court system as to take away the ability for the weaker party to have a voice through politics, there's something wrong. And we as Americans need to be asking that question. And I would challenge my colleagues to start thinking about that. At what point in time does the president have to follow the Constitution? Or at least does the Congress have to grant him powers before he can do these things? And that's just Chrysler. Now the GM deal, nobody says yet that they're going. I guess President Obama hasn't announced yet that they're going to the bankruptcy court, but they are trying to work out a settlement. Oh, going back to the Chrysler deal, doesn't it bother anyone that the deal we're making is taking control from the American stockholders away from the American stockholders, from the board of directors of Chrysler, giving ownership to the labor union? And I don't see any indication that the labor union is making the assumption of any of these debts, contributing any money to this project. They're just being rewarded for being a labor union. Now, where's the logic in that? And then what are they going to do? 35% of that is going to be fiat. I have nothing against fiat. I actually owned one time. So let me lay my cards on the table. It was a neat little yellow convertible, and my wife told me I couldn't keep it. But I owned one for a while. And it was fun and a good car. But now we're basically turning Chrysler over to a foreign company. I don't have anything against foreign companies. We're in an international world. But let's get a reality check here. The President of the United States is putting together a deal to turn Chrysler over to a foreign country and a foreign company. And that foreign company, you can bet your boots, one of these days the word Chrysler won't be in our vocabulary anymore. And I wish Fiat all the best, but realize that it will be the Fiat company of North America. Or at least logic would seem to think so. And all this is to make sure that we meet a pledge that the President of the United States made to the UAW, that he would protect their benefits and pension. You know, the government didn't protect the benefits and pension of the Delta pilots when Delta went bankrupt. So why all of a sudden is the government going into ownership of this company and taking direct direction of this company to make sure that it benefits this labor union rather than another labor union? It's a question we ought to be asking. It's a question some court ought to be looking into. This concerns me. Before I keep going any further, I do want to go ahead and lay the supposedly GM deal that the White House is telling us looks like this is what they're recommending. And I read this on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. 50% of General Motors would be owned by the United States government. 39% of General Motors would be owned by the UAW. 10% of the company would be owned by the bondholders, so at least the bondholders of General Motors are going to end up with 10% ownership. And the stockholders are going to do all right too. They're going to go from at least more than 1%. They're going to go from some percentage of GM down to 1%. So if you're the proud owner of GM stock, then you're all the stock that's out there is going to be worth 1% of General Motors. One of our members was telling me that he owned, I forget what he said, 1,000 shares of General Motors or something like that. I mean, the diluted price is estimated to be somewhere between 2 cents and a nickel a share for General Motors stock. General Motors, that great icon of American industrial might, who many pension funds, teachers' retirement funds, and other people invested in them because they were like the American flag. They were American industry at its best. And now all those people and all those funds that invested in stock are going to own 1% of a company that they used to own most of the company. And they're going to take the burden, the great burden of the mistakes made by General Motors. And I would argue the overwhelming pressure put on by the United Auto Workers to maintain at all costs their right of contract. You know, there are written and unwritten contracts, but the contract is sacred in America. And the unions certainly stand up for the rights under their contract. But under creditors' rights, there are rights too. They're created by law. And a person who does something and buys stock or invests in a bond, those people have the right to rely upon the law to protect them, just like a contract. But it seems every day as we go forward in the Obama administration, the sanctity of contract seems to get of less and less importance. And truthfully, that'll be terrible for this nation. I am very pleased and blessed to have my good friend from Iowa, Steve King, to be here with me tonight. I will yield to him such time as he may wish to consume.
I thank the gentleman and judge